The first stage of the argument is to consider the distinction between public and private law. I'm not quite sure what the students here are taught. At Oxford, I have to say that well, as a student in Oxford studying the law, yes, there was a rough distinction between, there was certainly something called public law, I think. Private law wasn't really a category, I don't think, at that time. And fundamental rights or human rights law really wasn't mentioned at all. That human rights law was something to do with international law, which I was told was not really law at all, so not worth studying. That was my education. But it wasn't quite correct, because every now and again we did come across talk about rights in the connection with constitutional cases, where in leading cases concerning civil liberties, the courts did sometimes talk about fundamental rights. But the impression that was given, certainly, was that rights only applied, fundamental rights only applied in the context of public law, and that they had nothing to do with private law, contracts and tort. They were never mentioned. And so there was a very sharp separation between public and private law. And I've tried to illustrate this by this little picture, which shows a semi-detached house. I don't suppose you have those in Hong Kong, but I live in one. And it's a house. There's two families live here, and between us there's a wall that goes from the ground to the top of the roof, and the two houses are separate, although you can sometimes hear the yelling of the neighbours or the teenagers playing their music, but they are separate houses, and we have separate wiring, meters, everything's separate. So they are. It's just the convenience. It's cheaper to build houses like that. And the model of public and private law I have in mind as the traditional view is, or certainly the view that I was taught, is rather like this semi-detached house, where on the one side there's public law, and on the other side there's private law, and the fundamental rights or human rights or any constitutional rights, they're all on the public law side. And the difference is said to be this, that these two neighbours, the public lawyers, are concerned with the rights and obligations that apply to relations between citizen and the state, the government, whereas private law concerns relations between private citizens, individuals, or associations of individuals, like companies. On this conventional perspective, it's said that the idea of fundamental rights was developed originally and primarily to protect citizens against the misuse of state power, and therefore fundamental rights necessarily emerged in and exclusively to the public realm, the public law side of the semi-detached house. And that therefore the fundamental rights are only in the public law sphere, and that the private lawyers tend to take the view of my cat. I don't know if you can see my little cat there. That when my cat hears the neighbours yelling, he about fundamental rights or whatever my neighbours might be yelling about, that my cat tries to sleep through it and ignore it. I think that this picture I've put up is, I think, one that would look rather odd to most of my predecessors as Vinerian professors at Oxford. This chair that I hold is the oldest chair of English law in the English-speaking world, and the original holders of this chair, and over the years, would not, I think, have recognised this picture at all. For them, I think, fundamental rights were part of the whole of the common law, both public law and private law. The first holder of the chair, William Blackstone, back in about 80, William Blackstone, he said this in one of his lectures in Oxford: the idea and practice of political or civil liberty flourish in their highest vigour in these kingdoms, by which he means England and Scotland, where it falls little short of perfection and can only be lost or destroyed by the folly of the legislature. In other words, the judges have created all these wonderful fundamental rights, and the only danger to everyone's rights and liberties is presented by Parliament that might start meddling. But he doesn't draw a distinction between private law and public law. It's a seamless web of fundamental rights. So too, much later, another Vinerian professor, Albert Van Dicey, insisted that what the rule of law meant was the protection of fundamental rights. And he didn't draw a distinction between protection of fundamental rights in public law or private law. There were fundamental rights in contract law, freedom of contract, just as much as there were fundamental rights in public law areas. It's only recently, I think, that this image of a semi-detached house, two parts, public and private law, has developed. And because we've learnt it, I think, we sort of assume it's natural and always been that way, but I think it's in fact a rather recent development, and it may be as much a development of the private lawyers as the public lawyers being concerned about public law getting all the action, having exciting constitutional cases, and private lawyers saying, well, we just do something different. We don't meddle in politics, we don't meddle in policy, we don't need to think about rights. All that we do is enforce not fundamental rights, but just basic contractual rights and property rights. There are quite a few of my colleagues, professors in Oxford, take the view, which always astonishes me, that private law has no policy aspects to it at all, no welfare considerations, that judges should just enforce the rules and never think about the consequences of their decisions. I think only an Oxford professor could think that. We'll have to ask, there's some judges here, we'll ask them whether they never think about any consequences of their decisions. That seems very unlikely to me. So I'm just summarising here the public and private law distinction. That seems to be the conventional view of public and private law, and that I was brought up on, and it keeps fundamental rights out of private law altogether. There is a different view, however, which initially I found very attractive, which says this. It says that, the fundamental rights are somehow the magma of a legal system. That what happens, they've given me a little pointy thing, I'll see if I can do it. So what happens is that the fundamental rights are there somehow in the core of the earth, and then they shoot up out of the earth like a volcano, and the fundamental rights spread out and they solidify, and some of them help to constitute public law and some of them help to constitute private law, so that the fundamental rights flow out, but they form slightly different aspects of the legal system, but there's a common source. And I think it was something like that probably that Blackstone believed, that he thought that the judge-made common law was just full of fundamental rights, that this could provide the basis for both public law and private law, and that there were common values throughout. And certainly there are common values in public and private law. I've already mentioned some. I mentioned freedom of contract, for example, the liberty of the individual, freedom of contract. There's clearly a homology between those two ideas. Nevertheless, I think that this view that the legal system can be understood as somehow a creation of fundamental rights, and that public law and private law are all made of the same stuff, magma of fundamental rights, must be wrong ultimately, because I think that there are three crucial differences and some other less important ones about the role of fundamental rights in private law and public law. And I'm going to quickly take you through those three differences. There are some rights, some fundamental rights, that play an important role in public law, but they play at most a minor part in private law. For example, the right to a fair trial. Absolutely crucial in a public law context, that people should have the rights associated with a fair trial, a hearing, a proper defence, and so on. These are very important parts of controlling government action. In private law, it's true, if you've got somebody who's broken a contract with you, you want a fair trial, but that's not so central to one's concerns in contract law. It's about process, it's not the substance of the law. So some rights are not very significant in private law, whereas they are very significant in public law. Secondly, the meaning of these rights changes in all kinds of subtle ways, which it's hard to pin down. And we find that although the right seems to be stated in the same way, it turns out to be rather different. A couple of examples. In a public law context, if the government takes someone's property, then